The lab results came back, and I am sorry, man, there is no biological match, not any of them.
This is where it started. A regional hospital in rural Ohio. Ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of place you trust without thinking twice. 3 counties, 3 hospitals, and one woman who had no idea that the life she was building had already been decided for her by someone else. She held her babies the way every new mother does, with everything she had. She raised them alone. She worked. She showed up every single day, without complaint, without hesitation. And for 20 years, she loved them without reservation. She never once had a reason to doubt any of it.
I gave those children better lives, every single one of them. You can call it a crime, but I watched those mothers. I knew. I made a choice, and I would make it again.
None of there is a kind of pain that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with a crash or a warning. It arrives folded inside something ordinary. A phone call you almost didn't answer. A piece of paper sitting on a kitchen counter. A number on a lab report that shouldn't mean anything, except that it means everything. And when that pain finds you, it doesn't just break your heart. It breaks the story you have been telling yourself about your own life for 20 years. Every memory becomes a question. Every photograph becomes evidence. Every sacrifice you ever made. Every dollar you went without. Every night you chose to stay when leaving would have been easier. All of it suddenly lives inside a question mark so enormous you cannot see around it. That is the kind of pain that found Margaret Calloway on a cold Tuesday morning in the fall of 2007. She was standing in her kitchen in a house she had lived in for nearly 2 decades. The same kitchenware she had packed 3,000 school lunches. The same kitchenware she had sat up past midnight helping with homework she barely understood herself. The same kitchen where she had pressed her back against the counter and cried into a dish towel on the hardest nights her children would not hear her from the other room. She wash-holding a single piece of paper. And the life she had built with nothing but her own 2 hands was about to change forever. Not because of anything Margaret had done wrong, but because 20 years earlier, before she ever held her first child in her arms, someone else had already made a decision. A quiet, calculated, deeply personal decision. One that would take 2 decades to surface. And when it finally did, it would affect not just one family, but 11 families across 3 Ohio counties. This is the story of Margaret Calloway. And I need you to stay with me all the way to the end, because this story does not end where you think it ends. And the person at the center of it is not the kind of villain you are used to. Before we go any deeper, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, let me lay out exactly what we are dealing with here, because I want you to understand the full weight of this before we go back to the beginning. Margaret Calloway gave birth to 3 children. She raised all 3 of them essentially alone after her husband left. She worked 2 jobs for years at a stretch. She skipped meals. She showed up to every school event, every doctor's appointment, every single milestone that her children experienced from birth through adulthood. She was, by every measurable standard, a devoted, present, self-sacrificing mother. And then in 2007, a routine medical test revealed something that should have been impossible. None of the 3 children she raised were biological heirs. Not one. 3 pregnancies, 3 births, 3 children she had carried, delivered, and brought home from the hospital. 0 biological connection to any of them. How does something like that happen once, let alone 3 separate times, across 3 separate births in 3 different years? And who does something like that? Who makes a decision of that magnitude 3 separate times, and then continues their life as if nothing happened? Those are questions we are going to answer today, all of them. But to understand the answers, you need to understand who Margaret Calloway was before any of this happened. Margaret Ann Calloway was born in 1960 in a small town called Harlan, Ohio, a place that sits roughly 2 hours southeast of Columbus, deep in rural American landscape that rarely makes the news. Harlan was the kind of town where everyone knew your parents, knew your grandparents, knew what church you attended, and what your father did for work. Margaret's father, Raymond, worked at a grain elevator 12 miles outside of town. Her mother, Dorothy, cleaned houses and took in alterations. They were not poor in the way that made daily life uncertain, but they were always close enough to the edge that money was a constant, low-level presence in every conversation, every decision, every plan that reached more than a week into the future. People who knew Margaret as a child described the same things with remarkable consistency. A girl who was serious without being somber, quiet without being withdrawn. Possessed of a steady, grounded competence that made adults trust her with things they might not have trusted other children with. She was the child you called on when something needed doing. The one who stayed to help clean you after the church picnic when the other kids had already run off toplay. It came from somewhere deep inside her. A specific, innate instinct for commitment. Once she decided something mattered, she gave it everything. That quality would define her entire life. It would also, in ways she could not have imagined, make her the perfect target for what was coming. She met David Calloway at a 4th of July gathering in 1981. David was outgoing in a way Margaret was not, social in the way that made rooms easier to move through. They married in June of 1983. The early years were good. Not extraordinary, but genuinely good. What Margaret wanted more than anything was children. She had always known this about herself. It was not a vague wish. It was a specific, deeply felt desire she could trace back to the years she had spent helping raise her younger brother, to the clarity she felt holding her cousin's newborn at 17 and thinking, with complete conviction, that she was built for this. Her first pregnancy came in the fall of 1986. She gave birth on April 14, 1987, at Harlan County Regional Hospital. The labor lasted 11 hours. And at 9:47 in the evening, a baby boy was placed in her arms and she felt something open inside her chest that she had no language for. She named him Daniel Raymond Calloway, Raymond for her father. 3 years later, a girl arrived, Rachel Dorothy Calloway, Dorothy for her mother. And in August of 1993, a third child, a boy named James Harold Calloway. 3 children, 3 births, a house that now held everything Margaret had ever wanted. And for a brief, beautiful stretch of time, she felt entirely complete. Then David left. In the spring of 1995, when James was not yet years old, David told Margaret he needed to go. There was no single incident. There was just a husband who walked out one Saturday morning with 2 suitcases and a face Margaret described, years later, as the face of a person who has already been gone for much longer than you realized. She filed for divorce in 1996. She was granted full custody of Daniel, Rachel, and James. She was 36 years old. She had 3 children aged 9, 6, and 3, and she was from that point forward entirely on her own. What Margaret did next is, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. She did not collapse. She went back to work. She found a second job. She arranged childcare with a neighbor. She worked at the medical supply company during the day and cleaned offices 3 nights a weekend on Saturday mornings. She got up at 5 in the morning and went to bed at 11 at night, and she did this for 6 years without stopping long enough to acknowledge how tired she was, because acknowledging it would have made it real in a way she couldn't afford. She made Daniel's baseball games. She made Rachel's school plays. She made James's kindergarten graduation. Her children grew up knowing one foundational truth above all others. Their mother would be there. That was the bedrock of their entire childhood. And Margaret believed with every part of herself that the family she had built was exactly what it appeared to be. That belief held for 20 years, until a routine medical test cracked it open. It started with Daniel. He was 20 years old in the fall of 2007, working in logistics outside Columbus, and his girlfriend Karen had encouraged him to register for the bone marrow donor registry. He registered in September. The blood draw was routine. The paperwork was unremarkable. When the follow-up letter arrived, Daniel almost didn't open it. But the language in the first paragraph was careful in a way that made him read it twice. It referenced a blood type result that had generated a flag and recommended he contact the lab for clarification of his medical history. Daniel called. The lab technician pulled the file, looked at the blood type result, cross-referenced it against the information Daniel had provided about his parents, and after a brief silence that Daniel noticed and found odd, he said that there appeared to be an inconsistency and that Daniel might want to discuss it with his physician. Daniel asked directly whether the man was suggesting what it sounded like he was suggesting. The technician said carefully that a blood typing consistency of this nature between a child and the listed biological parents was uncommon and warranted follow-up. Daniel hung up the phone, sat in his apartment for 45 minutes without moving. Then he called his mother. Margaret's response was one of the things that people who knew Harold ways came back to when describing how she operated under pressure. She listened to Daniel's account with focused stillness, asked 2 clarifying questions, and then said, in a voice that Daniel later described as very, very calm in a way that was more frightening than if she had been upset, she said she would look into it. She told him it was probably a clerical error. She said this with complete composure, and then got off the phone and sat down at the kitchen table and put both hands flat on the surface and breathed. She breathed for a long time, because what she had told Daniel was not what she actually believed. What she actually believed in that moment was something she did not yet have words for. A loosening. A sensi off the floor shifting slightly underfoot. She ordered a private DNA test online that same evening. No doctor, no referral. Just a kit that arrived by mail, 2 swabs, a prepaid return envelope, and 10 business days of waiting. She swabbed it herself. She waited for Daniel to come to Sunday dinner, and while was watching football in the living room, she went into the bathroom and retrieved the glass he had used for water and swabbed the rim of it. She stood in the bathroom holding that swab and later told a journalist, "I felt like I was doing something terrible, and I knew I was doing something necessary, and I couldn't decide which of those feelings I was supposed to trust." She mailed the samples the next morning. She checked the mailbox every day. On the 10th day, she got the results. She opened the envelope standing at the mailbox on the sidewalk with cars passing behind her and a neighbor's dog barking 2 yards over and the ordinary world continuing entirely without awareness of what was happening in this specific spot. She read the numbers. 0% probability of maternity. She read it was, folded the paper back into the envelope, walked inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and did not move for 3 hours. She ordered 2 more kits. One for Rachel, one for James. She collected the samples without telling either of them. She mailed the kits the same day. She waited. The results for Rachel arrived on a Tuesday, 0%. The results for James arrived 2 days later, 0%. Margaret sat with all 3 sets of results spread on the kitchen table in front of her and looked at them for a long time without picking any of them up. 3 children, 3 births, 3 hospitals she had trusted the way you trust the ground beneath your feet. 0, 0, 0. She called an attorney named Michael Reeves within 48 hours. She brought all 3 sets of DNA results and every piece of paperwork still had from those births. She sat across from him and told everything in a voice he later described, in a deposition, as the steadiest he had heard from any client disclosing anything of this nature in 23 years of practice. She was not steady because Sesh was unaffected. She was steady because there was work to do. Michael Reeves filed a formal complaint with the Ohio Department of Health within 2 weeks. The complaint initiated an investigation that, like most regulatory processes, moved slowly through its early phases and gained speed only when it hit things that could not be explained away. The first hospital, where Daniel and Rachel had been born, had closed in 1999. Its records had been transferred to a state archive, but a significant portion of the obstetric files had been damaged in a flood in 2003. The investigator assigned to the state complaint, a woman named Linda Marsh from the Office of Medical Integrity, spent 3 weeks working through what remained and found enough to confirm the general timeline of Margaret's deliveries and identify the nursing staff on duty during the first 2 births, but not enough to establish a clear chain of what had happened after delivery. The third hospital, Morrow Creek General, where James had been born in 1993, was still operating, and it had records. The records administrator, a woman who had worked there for 31 years, pulled James's birth file and found something she flagged immediately for Linda Marsh, a discrepancy in the nursery log. A notation indicating James had been moved to intermediate care during the first 12 hours after birth, standard in certain cases, but the corresponding return notation was logged by a different staff member than was scheduled, at a time inconsistent with the shift documentation. In isolation, it looked like ordinary administrative slippage, except the records administrator recognized the handwriting. She had seen it before, on files from a decade earlier. On files that had generated other questions she had never been able to fully resolve. She pulled files from the early 1990s The late 1980s, everything she could find involving deliveries during the periods in question. The handwriting appeared again. 3 times in the Morrow Creek General records alone. Each time associated with a nursery transfer that didn't quite align with the surrounding documentation. Each time initialed with the same 2 letters. CB, she brought what she had found to Linda Marsh. Linda Marsh brought it to the Ohio State Medical Board and the Morrow Creek County Sheriff's Office. Because UHAT they were looking at was no longer a regulatory complaint. It was the beginning of a pattern. And patterns have names attached to them. The name belonged to Carol Bennett. Carol Ann Bennett, whose full name would eventually appear in court documents, in state medical board filings, and in the testimony of 11 families. Carol Bennett was 62 years old when investigators first contacted her. She had retired from nursing in 2001, after a career spanning more than 20 years across 7 healthcare facilities in 3 Ohio counties. She lived alone in a small house in a town called Welford, about 40 miles from Harlan. Her neighbors described her the way people describe someone they do not actually know. She kept to herself, she was always civil, they didn't know much about her past. Carol Bennett had been born in 1945 in Cincinnati. She went into nursing in the mid-1960s with a combination of genuine calling and limite alternatives. By all accounts from her early career, she was skilled, professional, and well-regarded. She received commendations. She was promoted. She mentored younger nurses. She specialized in obstetric nursing in the mid-1970s, working in labor and delivery in the specific and intimate space of new beginnings. New mothers trusted her. That trust was, it turned out, something she used. In 1983, Carol Bennett experienced a pregnancy of her own. She was 38, unmarried, and the pregnancy had not been planned. The baby, a girl, born at 36 weeks in March of 1984, did not survive. A cord complication during delivery. The medical record was straightforward. The grief was not. Colleagues who knew Carol in the year that followed described something shifting in her. A quieting, an increasing distance, a developing reaction to mothers she assessed as inattentive or insufficiently grateful. She didn't say anything unprofessional, but the internal judgment was there in ways it hadn't been before. And slowly, over the months and years that followed, that judgment hardened into something with practical consequences. Investigators pieced together the full timeline through hospital records, witness accounts, staffing logs, and the discovery off notebooks Carol Bennett had kept, handwritten, meticulous, and deeply disturbing, in a locked box in the attic of her Welford house. The notebooks contained entries dating back to 1986. They described her assessments of the mothers she worked with, their circumstances, their readiness, what she perceived as their failings, and they described the arrangements she had made. The decisions she had taken on behalf of children she had decided needed better lives, the families she had identified to receive those children, and the names of 11 children who had been in the private language of Carol Bennett's notebooks relocated. That was the word she used, relocated. Not stolen, not taken, relocated. As if she were a citiplaner reassigning properties to better uses. As if the children were parcels and the mothers were zoning classifications she had found unsuitable. That word would stay with everyone who encountered it long after everything else had been processed and filed and adjudicated. What she had done, in concrete physical terms, was this. In hours immediately after a birth, during the period when the mother was recovering and the newborn was in the nursery, Carol Bennett would arrange a switch. She had contacts at the facilities where she worked, informal networks that facilitated private adoptions outside official channels. She would take a newborn from a mother she had designated as undeserving and replace that child with a newborn from another source. She would log the transfer in a way that, under normal scrutiny, looked like ordinary nursery procedure. She had learned, over years, exactly how much deviation from standard protocol a tired, understaffed ward would absorb without triggering review. She knew the seams in the system because she had worked those systems for 2 decades. Margaret Calloway, investigators concluded, had been designated by Carol Bennett as a mother who deserved children, but whose circumstances, the instability of her marriage, the financial precarity already visible by the time of Daniel's birth in 1987, had made Carol decide that the specific children Margaret gave birth to would be better served elsewhere. She had written about Margaret in her notebooks, by the initials MC, across 3 separate entries spanning 1987 to 1993. She had noted Margaret's care, her evident devotion, her obvious love for her children. And then she had written that MC would be a good mother to any child, and that the children she gave birth to would receive more from the arrangements Carol had made for them. She wrote this as if she were doing Margaret a favor. Carol Bennett was arrested in March of 2009 at her home in Welford. The arresting officers reported that she answered the door and her house echoed at 8 in the morning, looked at them without alarm, and said, before they had fully identified themselves, that she had been expecting this, and could she give the cat his breakfast first. She was charged with 14 counts including identity fraud, illegal adoption brokerage, falsification of medical records, and medical negligence. The investigation took 4 years from arrest to conviction. 11 families were ultimately identified. And through all of it, Margaret Calloway attended every public proceeding she was able to attend, sitting in the courtroom with a composure that observers consistently noted. The composure of someone who has decided to witness something fully, without looking away, because looking away would be a form of dishonor to what happened. Here is where Margaret's story diverges from the others. In 2011, a 24-year-old woman named Melissa Turner saw a brief segment on a Columbus television news program about the Bennett investigation. Melissa had grown up knowing she was adopted. Her adoptive parents, Gary and Corinne Turner, had told her the truth when she was 7 years old, and she had carried that knowledge as simple a part of the texture of who she was, something she thought about sometimes, and didn't think about other times, and had never felt an urgent need to pursue because her life with the Turners was genuinely good. But when she watched the television segment and saw the dates, the counties, the specific hospitals named, she sat down on her couch and watched it 3 times. Then she called Corinne Turner and said, "Mom, I think you need to turn on the television." Melissa sent a letter to the tip line listed in the segment. The investigators called within a week. A DNA sample was taken and matched against Margaret Calloway's file. The probability came back at 99.97%. Melissa Turner was Margaret Calloway's biological daughter, born in October of 1987. Taken from Margaret at Harlan County Regional Hospital in the first hours after her birth. Melissa was the child Margaret had been holding that night in April of 1987, the child she had brought home and named Daniel and loved and raised for 20 years was not her biological son. Her biological daughter had been raised by someone else, 28 miles away, never knowing what she was missing, because you cannot miss something you have no knowledge of. Margaret was told about the DNA match by Linda Marsh in a meeting at Head Department of Health offices in Columbus in late 2011. Linda Marsh left space after delivering the information because the ways people receive news of this kind are impossible to predict. Margaret sat in that space for a long time. When she finally spoke, she asked one question. Linda Marsh has quoted it in every interview she has given about this case since, because it is, she says, the most precise encapsulation of what this case was ultimately about. Margaret asked, "Is she okay?" Not, "Is she mine?" Not, "Can I see her?" "Is she okay?" Linda Marsh said yes. And Margaret put her face in her hands and breathed for a long time. Then raised her head and said, "All right, tell me what happens next." Melissa Turner wrote Margaret a 3-page handwritten letter. In it described her life with Gary and Corinne Turner, her childhood, her education, her work as a nurse, an obstetric nurse. She worked in a labor and delivery unit at a hospital in Columbus. She had chosen the profession because she found the specific intimacy of birth meaningful. Something in her had always oriented toward that beginning. She had written to Margaret with a quality of openness that Margaret found, she later said, almost unbearably generous. Like being given a gift you haven't earned, by someone who has every right to withhold it. They met for the first time in February of 2012 at a quiet coffee shop in Columbus on a Tuesday morning. Melissa was there first. Margaret arrived and stopped walking when she came through the door and saw her daughter standing at a table across the room and looked at her and saw, she has said this the same way every time, she saw her mother's hands. Her own mother, Dorothy's hands. The exact same knuckle structure, the same slight taper at the fingers. A detail so specific, so physically intimate, so impossible to predict, that it produced in Margaret an experience she described as the floor and the ceiling swapping places. She walked to the table. And whatever happened in that meeting, the things they said, the silences between things they said, the compressed and overwhelming beginning off an entire relationship, is theirs. What is known is that they met for more times in 2012, and that by the end of that year they were in regular contact. But nobody had prepared for what came next. When Melissa told Corinne Turner about the DNA match, about Margaret, about the investigation, Corinne went quiet in a way Melissa recognized from childhood, as the way her mother went quiet when something was crossing a threshold inside her. Corinne then told Melissa something she had not told anyone in 24 years. Corinne Turner had given birth to a child in 1990 at Harlan County Regional Hospital, a baby girl. She had been told shortly after the birth that the baby had experienced complications. She had been given another infant to take home, a healthy infant she named Melissa. She had raised that infant as her daughter, loved her with everything she had. But she had always, in the quietest part of herself, known that something about the story she had been given did not fully hold together. Now Melissa was pulling on that thread, and the thread connected to something neither of them had been prepared to find. Corinne Turner had also been a victim. The child she had given birth to had also been taken. She had also raised someone else's baby while her own biological daughter grew up in a house she never entered. Two women, both robbed by the same person, connected by Melissa, who carried in her own person the evidence of both their losses. The meeting between Margaret Calloway and Corinne Turner, arranged through the investigators and supported by a counselor, was one of the most emotionally complex events in a case full of them. Two women sitting across from each other, holding the same loss from different angles. Margaret later said, "I did not know what to say to her. I could not decide if we were the same or completely different. And then I realized we were both. And that was the thing I had to hold." Corinne Turner said in a statement to investigators, "I looked at her and thought, she knows. She is the only person in this room Calloway watched her from the third row, and Carol Bennett took the stand in her own defense in the jury deliberated for 4 days. Guilty on 11 of the 2.5 days. 19 her testimony wastes Carol Bennett was 68 years old at sentencing. She described her actions remarks said something that has been quoted in every major piece of journalism about this case since. She used the word relocated again. The court recognizes that the defendant operated from an airing containing Margaret Calloway and Corinne Turner. The court also recognizes other pain does not grant permission. She said she had relocated children before us did not create the pain that produced these actions. She said she would the ones who have had to absorb its consequences. She said she had lost a child. That asymmetry is what justice is for career, making sure and what children did not go fully repair. Margaret Calloway is 64 years old now. She said this without ever looking. Daniel and Rachel during those 2.5 days, the three she raised, the people in that courtroom who represented the human cost, they called her certainty. They still do. Daniel made it clear from the beginning that his responsido, everything he had learned, was uncomplicated. Margaret was his mother, full stop, and no DNA result would change that. Rachel went to therapy, did the work, and came out with a clarity and wholeness that most people never achieve under any circumstances. James, the most emotionally intuitive of the three, had the hardest time not because he loved Margaret less, but because he felt the weight off what she had carried, and it affected him in ways that took longer to metabolize. All three of them are fine. In the specific, complicated, not without difficulty way that people are fine after something serious, with more understanding than before, with things they will always carry, and with the bedrock of a family built on 20 years of real, deliberate, daily love that nothing can dissolve. Melissa is something different and something also clear. She has a mother in Corinne Turner, whom she loves completely. She has a biological mother in Margaret, whom she is coming to know across the compressed intimacy of reunion, trying to absorb in years what was meant to accumulate over a lifetime. She is still an obstetric nurse. She considered leaving the profession when the full nature of the case became clear to her. She stood at that fork in her internal road for a long time, and then she decided to stay. She said the vast majority of what happens in labor and delivery units across this country is people arriving in their most vulnerable moment and being met by people who take that vulnerability seriously. She did not want Carol Bennett's corruption of that to drive her out of work she believed in. She stayed, and that choice is perhaps the most completing swear anyone in this story has managed to give to what Carol Bennett did. You take the thing that was used as a weapon, and you turn it back into what it was supposed to be, This story forces a question that most of us never have to face. What makes a parent? Is it blood? Is it the 3 a.m. fevers and the school lunches and the staying when it was hard? Margaret raised 3 children who were not biologically hers. She gave them everything. And those children are who they are in significant part because of her. Because of what she showed them and gave them and insisted in for them. Biology was not there. The family was. And then Chef found in her early 50s a daughter she had never known, who was already fully formed, already complete, already good. A woman raised by different hands who nonetheless showed up with her own mother's hands, carried forward through the blood in a way that 20 years of separation had not erased. Both of these things are true at the same time. The family you build with your hands and your years and your daily choice is real. The family written in the blood is real. They are not competing truths. They are both simply real. And that task for everyone in this story has been to hold both of them without letting either one destroy the other. They are doing it, not perfectly, not without difficulty, but they are doing it. Margaret has said something about her 20 years of not knowing that has stayed with me since the first time I encountered this case. She said, I think I knew in the part of me that knows things I don't want to know, and I decided not to know it. And then she said, I am glad I didn't know, because not knowing meant I loved them without reservation, and I would not trade that for anything, not even that truth. I have thought about that sentence many times, about what it means to love without reservation, about how that effortless love becomes something deliberate once the knowledge arrives, and how Margaret made the choice to continue it. Every day, she made that choice. For Daniel and for Rachel and for James and for Melissa and for Alafit, the 20 years behind her and the years still ahead. That is what devotion looks like when it is tested by the worst possible circumstances. You show up anyway. You keep going. And the family Margaret has imperfect, complex, built on 20 years often knowing and several years of knowing and a daily act of will that most of us will never be tested on, is real. Entirely, completely, and irreversibly real. Before you go, I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want you to think about it before you answer. If you were Daniel or Rachel or James, if someone had given you 20 years of everything they had, and then the DNA said the biology wasn't there, would that change anything? Would it change who she is to you? Drop your answer in the comments below. I read every single one. And if this story moved you the way it moves everyone I have shared it with, please share it with someone you think should hear it. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, because the next story we are covering involves a man who was declared legally dead twice, in 2 separate states, while he was very much alive, and the family members who had very specific reasons for wanting that declaration to stand. That one is coming soon.